All right, welcome to the lecture Evolutionary Basics. We're going to run through the basic mechanics of how evolution works and talk about how that applies to psychology. All right, so here's the lecture outline. We'll start with Darwin, then understand how evolutionary theory puts humans in a different context. Then we'll talk about the basics, the engine, I call it, of evolution, how that works, applied to some human traits, then talk about reproductive fitness, and then talk about how evolutionary psychology tries to challenge some of the ways that social science tends to get done. All right, here's our buddy, Charles Darwin, and these are his famous finches. He went on a tour with a ship known as the Beagle back in the 1800s, and he gathered a lot of data and made a lot of observations that he would use in writing his Origin of Species book. And so these are finches that, because they depend on different food sources in the Galapagos Islands, eventually evolved different kinds of beaks customized to those food sources. Okay, so Darwin's big book, The Origin of Species, was written in 1859, and the subtitle is By Means of Natural Selection. So natural selection is taken as a synonym for evolution. And we have here, Darwin made a number of just wonderful drawings. Here's some monkeys that he was studying and trying to understand the relationship among. And of course, there was a lot of controversy about Darwin's theory. Here's a famous drawing where it's putting Darwin's head on a monkey, suggesting that he was kind of making a fool of himself for drawing any parallels between humans and apes or monkeys. All right, so one way of understanding evolution, this is kind of an archaic phrase, but it's still kind of beautiful, I think, is understanding evolution as descent with modification. So in terms of descent, it means that there's a common ancestor, which we would locate here. These are Darwin's notes from one of his notebooks. A common ancestor here is at the bottom of the page. And then descent with modification means the descendants gradually change in different kinds of directions, depending on random variations and also selective pressures. And that produces the amazing variety of life that we see out there. So all these different creatures, these different insects, came from a progenitor, a common ancestor, and all life on Earth is linked in this way. All right, so one of the chief values of evolutionary theory for psychology is it puts humans in this larger natural context. So humans aren't understood as something different from animals, but as a type of animal. And so you can see here that there was an ancestral primate back in the day, as it were, millions of years ago. And then from that ancestral primate, there's these different branches that came off. And there are these monkeys over here. And then we get to our closer relatives, the great apes, and especially chimpanzees. And humans are part of that branch. So we didn't evolve from monkeys, but we do share a common ancestor with monkeys. And there's a more, one that's closer to us that we share just with chimpanzees. So chimps and bonobos, it was only I think it was like in the 1950s that they realized that these certain chimpanzees were actually different species. They weren't chimpanzees at all. They were the sister species bonobo. But we, along the humans, chimps, and bonobos, share a common ancestor back here that we split off from. And there's a bunch of other cousins that humans had along the way that have since died off. There's actually more than one kind of human. In other words, in terms of the Latin Homo. And this is a graph you'll often see in evolutionary stuff. It's millions of years ago. So you can see the split with the common ancestor for the chimps and bonobos was about 8 million years ago. Okay, so chimps provide a great data point for human nature. So it's a little bit similar to if you're looking at trying to understand something and you're trying to understand if it's nature or nurture, and you look at two identical twins that were reared apart. And if they have similarities, even though they were raised in different environments, it suggests there's something innate to their genes that was guiding that behavior. So it's a similar kind of logic where we share so much in common with chimps. It's about 98% of our DNA that we share in common. But you can look here just in the facial expressions. We have basically the same set of muscles and facial features that are manipulated into the different kinds of emotional expressions. So chimps provide this window into human evolution because they're such a close cousin. So for example, when we're trying to look and see whether or not war is a part of human nature, we will look at chimps and see if there's any similarities. And in fact, we will see some similarities in terms of the way they use male coalitionary violence. Okay, so the logic is if we share some of the physical features of the chimps, then we might share some of the psychology too. So we can learn something about our own tendencies towards aggression and intergroup conflict by understanding what's going on with chimps. However, obviously, we do share, in spite of the things we share, there are some major differences. Humans have language, and that enables us to gossip about people. In other words, share information about people that are not present at that moment. And that totally changes the coalitionary dynamics that humans are able to sustain and the ways they can interact. Okay, we did have other relatives, other homos, and they are now gone. So you can look here in the tree. One clear thing you want to see is it's not a straight line from a common ancestor to humans. There were other kinds of humans that were around at the same time or at previous times. But nature, evolution throws up a lot of different options, and some of them take and hold for a long period of time, and some of them go extinct in fairly short order. But you can see here, Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthals existed at the same time, and there's some evidence that there was some interbreeding among them, in that if you look at some of our DNA, there's traces of Homo neanderthalis in there as well. But this raises a question when you look at these other lines that died out. Why did human Homo sapiens persist? Just another picture of this. This is just the diversity in the hominid line. So if you look at some of these other homos or hominids, it's hard to say that they're entirely like us or that they're entirely like other kinds of primates. It's clear they're what we might call some intermediary forms or some other ways of that evolution was expressed. In other words, this is an argument against any kind of thing saying humans are a totally different and distinct species. We have some pretty close cousins that don't look at all like most of the apes that we think about, and yet don't quite look like us. And we should remember that the humans were unique as a species in terms of their ability to colonize the planet. You can look at certain things like bacteria as being very versatile and adapted to different kinds of environments, but it's unique the way that humans, especially for a creature as large as us, an animal, to have colonized the planet in the way that we did. But we started in Africa, and then we have research on DNA that can trace out exactly when and where we ended up in different locations. So you can see the Americas were the most recently colonized. You should also notice here that this is tracing the routes both of humans and these other closely related hominid lines. Okay, so now we're on to the evolutionary basics, and we're going to talk about the core engine of evolution. I think about these things as three cogs that, if they're interacting and the cogs are turning, you are producing evolution. So the three pieces here are cogs. One is variability. You have to have some differences in an attribute. So people of different height, people of different levels of aggressiveness, different levels of balance, different levels of honesty, all kinds of things that people can differ in, or species. Then some of those, if some of those attributes are tied to the inheritance, in other words, to our genetic wiring, they aren't just things that are characteristics or traits that we pick up as we go through life, but they're, in other words, somehow hardwired in the genome. Then you have two of the three pieces you need for evolution. And then the third one is you need some kind of selection pressure. So these are the kinds of pressures that act on inherited attributes. All right, so as soon as you have selection pressures, in other words, things happening in the environment that affect whether or not a given attribute contributes to evolutionary success or makes it less likely that that organism is going to produce offspring, then you have all you need for evolution to occur. So you think about certain things that could be going on in the environment. If you have famine, it might produce some selective pressures against tall people, because tall people have a higher calorie count that they need to survive. So it might favor smaller sizes. Or think about armed conflict. In that case, if there's interspecies conflict with humans, it might select against shorter men, because we know other things being equal, taller men are more formidable and are better able to do things like throw spears. Then another selective pressure would be the availability of family. So you can imagine the genes being set up in such a way is if you had family to collaborate with, families would be people that share some of your genes, you might be oriented toward that family in a way that's different than non-family. But that would be one thing in the environment that could offer a selective pressure. Okay, so one of the classic examples that we see in the biology literature is what happened with moths during the Industrial Revolution. So moths naturally have some variability in color. You can obviously see one moth here, but there's another one you might not see as easily that's a darker color. So the genes of the moth have diversity, and they produce a population that has both white-colored moths and dark-colored moths. Well, when the Industrial Revolution comes along, it changes the selective pressures because suddenly the trees become a lighter color because they have all the soot from the burning of the coal. So because of that, you'll see that the frequency of the genes in the population changed. So here's a nice representation of that. In the pre-industrial revolution, you had one kind of environment with the light-colored trees. So think about like a birch tree. And then in the post-industrial revolution, you have this much darker tree because it's covered by soot. And so over time, and then obviously the kicker is birds are trying to eat these moths. If it's this kind of environment, the white moth is favored because it has better camouflage. If it's this kind of environment, the black moth is favored because it has that kind of environment. So you can see the proportion of moths that are black when it starts off is very small. But over time, as the years go by, the proportion of those moths gets larger. And then the white moths become fewer and fewer. So two things to note. The moths aren't trying to change color. It's just that some of them live and the other ones don't live as well or die more frequently. And so the proportion of these colorings in the population changes. And just another thing to note is there's a reason why, or you can understand that the diversity of genes is useful to a species because you never know what's going to change in the environment, where something that may not appear to be very useful, that is a dark coloring, in fact, because of changes in the environment, becomes the thing that lets that species continue to exist. Another point here I'll make is that we're not talking about survival of the fittest. In other words, there is no universal fittest form. What's fittest is that which is fitted to the current environment. So there's no objective ontological better. It's only what is working given what else is going on in the environment. All right, there's this great simulation you can do. That's the full URL, but if you plug in just my little shortened URL, you'll get there. But you can you can be the bird, so to speak, and try to chomp down on these moths, and you will find that when you are a bird hunting in the white-colored area, the black moths are either easier to pick up, and when you're a bird hunting in the black tree environment, the white moths are easier to pick up. And it'll keep track, if you do this, of what happens to the number of moths that you eat, and you'll see that differential selective pressure that produces that evolution that we saw in the previous slide. All right, point number 4. Evolution explains not just moths, but all kinds of human traits. So to pick one to start with that's a physical trait about our species that's kind of perplexing for some people is why childbirth is painful and dangerous for human females. Well, one story is that Eve misbehaved in the Garden of Eden, and this was one of her punishments, is that she would always have, women since her would always have painful and dangerous childbirth. Another way of looking at this is it's a consequence of humans evolving to walk upright, and that produced a problem. So if you're walking, and this is argued in a recent paper that has some good data to support this, but if you're walking on all fours, the baby is better positioned to stay in the womb. But as soon as you start walking upright, the baby, because of gravity, is falling down towards the pelvis. And if the pelvis is too wide, the baby's going to fall out. But if the pelvis is too narrow, it makes the birth really difficult. So evolution does what it can, so to speak, and you have these competing selective pressures that create a stabilizing selection. You can't have the hips be too wide and you can't have them be too narrow. But it turns out that the compromise that evolution comes up with is still one that's not perfect. In other words, it used to be a lot of females would die in childbirth, and it's certainly not an experience many would describe as just comfortable. So evolution comes up with solutions, so to speak, but all it can do is modify what's already there, and there's sometimes constraints that force us into situations where we don't have the best outcomes. So walking upright is a larger constraint. Evolution can't produce ideal outcomes. All it can do is work with extant materials. Extant meaning things that are currently in existence. Okay, so that's evolution explaining something about humans that's not really psychological. But it can also explain human psychology. So think about something as simple as fear of heights. Imagine in the ancestral environment, back in the day, as it were, that there was a variability in fear levels. And some people just had no fear of heights whatsoever. Well, it's not surprising to think that given some variability in that over time, if humans are in environments where there's some steep hills and precipices and that sort of thing, that there could be some kind of selective pressures where those that had zero fear of heights were more likely to die without children. And it's likely why throughout most humans, there's some sense of fear about heights. Now, we can overcome that, and people that work in certain kinds of industries where they're often high above the skyline and whatnot, you can overcome that basic fear, but it's very likely that selective pressures in our ancestral environment cause that fear of heights. Now, you might notice I have some pictures here of some goats doing some crazy things. These are goats that are climbing this dam where they're going up higher and higher and higher to find these salt licks that is part of these stones that were used to make the dam. And these guys are up some 200, 300 feet. And it looks like for us, it would be a very dangerous kind of environment. Well, I'm just going to point out that the selective pressures faced by mountain goats were very different. In other words, those mountain goats that couldn't get comfortable in that kind of terrain were less likely to be able to access the resources that the ones that were able to get comfortable. So they have different selective pressures acting on them. They're in an environment where they have to be able to navigate those kind of heights. And some of my bet is there's still a certain kind of fear of heights, but there's also more comfort, obviously, with being able to negotiate those kind of terrains. So this one's just a very shocking picture. It's fun for the whole family. So mother goat has baby goat up there, and baby goat's going, "Mom, I don't know about this." And mama goat's going, "Oh, it's going to be fine." One other note with the goats here is the goats don't just have a certain psychological attitude that's independent of their body. So even though they don't have hands and arms to grab things, their whole body has been shaped by the kind of terrain that they navigate in, that is mountainous, steep cliffs kind of terrain. And so they have the skills and the agility and the muscles and the tendons and all that enables them to be very effective mountain climbers. Things that we don't have, given that we evolved in the forest and the savanna. Okay, so humans also have typically a fear of the dark. We might think of fear of the dark as somehow immature or irrational, but it's reasonable to imagine that our ancestors faced more risks in the dark. So there might be wild beasts that could be more likely to prey on humans if they that would be out at night. If you're venturing into dark areas at night, you're more likely to get hurt. And you can also imagine that if there was conflict between different kinds of humans, that might be when humans would get picked off, so to speak, is if they're out by themselves wandering around in the dark. So something doesn't have to be so-called rational for it to have a certain kind of effect on the species evolution. It's also interesting to note that the fear of the dark comes about with babies just about at the time that they start being mobile, start being able to crawl around and get around on their own. So it makes sense that it would set in about then, because that's when their behavior needs to be curtailed a little bit to keep them safe. You can also think about disgust at spoiled food. So if you smell food that is spoiled, there is an instinctive reaction where you will make a certain face and pull back. That is a modification of a reaction where you would actually spit something out and try to get it away from you. So we find it disgusting, but the reason we find it disgusting is those ancestors of ours that didn't find the food disgusting were more likely to eat it and then get sick from the bacteria. So if we have a certain amount of disgust at spoiled food, that can be advantageous. However, if that disgust level is too high, we might avoid eating food that maybe isn't as fresh as we'd like, but it still could provide some nutritional value. So you can see again how there'd be some constraints on both sides. Then let's think about the appeal of high-fat foods like meat. Well, many people would say meat cooking over a grill smells great. And there might be some reason in our evolutionary history that we came to like meat. Think about the kinds of calories and the density of calories you can get from meat. It's a really valuable food source if you're trying to get some high quality calories in short order. So it makes sense that there's certain foods that might be kind of hard to get, like meat, because you have to hunt it down, but it's worth it if you can get it. Might be really desirable. It might taste really good because that taste is motivating you to overcome some of the challenges. Now, that can be dysfunctional in our current environment when high calorie foods are too readily available and you can get them in any convenience store very quickly. So again, we have to think about what was going on in the ancestral environment to understand why we have the kinds of traits and habits that we do. All right, and then two that deal with sexual selection, or how the attraction or interaction between the species create a selection pressure. So males that are attracted to women in their early 20s would be being attracted to women that are highly fertile, and furthermore, women that are likely to be fertile for a good number of years. So that makes sense that there was some selective pressures that cause males to be attracted to the markers of fertility, so to speak. So not too young so that they weren't fertile, and not too old so that their years of fertility were too curtailed. It can make sense how human psychology would have shaped that. Evolution would have shaped that. Then we can also think about females attracted to financially successful men. Would that be beneficial? Sure. So we'll study this in some of the first few weeks here, but females have a whole lot of work to do in raising children, and because of the demands of children and their limits in terms of what they can do while they're taking care of children, especially in the ancestral environment, they would really benefit from having some men that had some resources that would that those men would be willing to share with those women. So that's one kind of resource. But you can also find women are attracted to men more often than not with broad shoulders. So what could that signal? Well, broad shoulders are likely to show that that person is capable of being a better fighter. So in other words, they can throw better, they could punch with more velocity, but they might be able to better outcompete other smaller men for those resources. So if you work the logic that females need resources to raise their offspring, it makes sense that they would be attracted to men with markers of the ability to do that. Okay, point 5, some more evolutionary basics here. So we're talking about evolution in general, not just applied to humans. But there's a concept called reproductive fitness that is really helpful to have in your toolkit. So if you have the core engine turning, where the variability, inheritance, and selection gears are all interacting, it creates a specific kind of game. And later we'll talk about how game theory explains different kind of phenomenon in evolution. But what I mean by game is a certain kind of pursuit or challenge that has certain kind of characteristics. And one of the characteristics of this kind of game is that things that enable more offspring increase what we call reproductive fitness. So if you think about it as what natural fitness is, that's whether an individual lives, right? If I'm fit, I'm likely to live longer than an individual that's not very fit, that's out of weight and out of shape and likely to die young. Well, reproductive fitness is an extension of that, but it's not looking at your longevity. It's looking at the success of your genes, the extent to which your genes will be propagated and pushed through the population out there of your species. So it's looking at whether or not you have kids and whether or not your kids have kids and the number and how successful they are and all that. So one way of thinking about reproductive fitness is that's kind of the metric of evolutionary success or the cache of an evolutionary game. So what I mean by cache is there can be many things that bring us benefits and bring us good stuff. But if it doesn't increase our reproductive fitness, in other words, if it can't play out down the road and increase the number of offspring we have, then it's not going to cash out. It can't be passed on to future generations, and it's eventually tenuous in terms of whether or not it continues. So, and just to think about here for a second, in this descent diagram I have, if there's an individual that has certain genes that enable them to produce more offspring, and it's the kind of offspring that are themselves fertile and they can have more offspring, what we're talking about with reproductive fitness is the total number of offspring over many generations. It's not just whether or not you can have one or two kids, because you can imagine having one or two kids that are relatively infertile or don't have a lot of children, or you can imagine having one kid that has a ton of children. So it can happen in different ways, but it's looking down the road, long term, how many offspring do you have that might carry on copies of your gene? That's reproductive fitness. Okay, so some examples of that. Male attraction to women in their 80 plus years of age. So if males are attracted to women in their 80s, and that's something that's hardwired into their genes, it's unlikely that that trait is going to be passed on, that it would produce reproductive fitness, because those women are going to be infertile at that age. So that would decrease your reproductive fitness. What about a male tendency to overestimate sexual interest? So there's a marked tendency for males when they encountered a female, and the female can just be behaving normally. Maybe she smiles briefly or says hello or whatever. Males tend to overestimate the extent to which that female is showing sexual interest in them. Now, the irony is, or the paradox is, they may be wrong. They may be wrong 9 times out of 10, but it could be in just a few cases where if they overestimate that, or they're inclined to see something that's not there, once in a while, it might pay out. Once in a while, they might get some mating interest that otherwise wouldn't be there. So even though it's at a base rate error, in other words, you are not being accurate in terms of your social perceptions, it can still take hold as a trait of male psychology, because we can see how it would increase the reproductive fitness. And then what about a strong female concern for her physical safety? Well, this is something we're going to talk about in the first few weeks here, but females really need to take care of themselves if they want to have reproductive fitness, because if they get injured or die, then it's very likely, at least in the ancestral environment, that their children would survive. So in other words, a woman has to be concerned about her physical safety, because she's the main caretaker for her children. And if she can keep herself alive, there's a much better chance that she can keep her children alive and that they can go on to have their own children. So there's an evolutionary logic behind the female concern for physical safety. So one normative clarification, and by normative I mean we're speaking about norms and values here. So something that enables reproductive fitness is not necessarily a good thing or a moral thing. So you can imagine, and this is a very controversial kind of topic, but there's some evidence that certain males under certain conditions have a tendency to want to coerce females for sexual intercourse. Well, you can imagine there being some kind of tendencies towards that because in the ancestral environment, it might have paid off. And so it might, to some extent, be a tendency that's brought out, at least in some situations with some individuals. But that by no means means that we as a society or as individuals need to see that behavior as appropriate or moral. So just a very simple example of that is if there is a willingness to murder certain key competitors, we can imagine how that might increase your reproductive fitness if you're killing off the competition. But society can very easily step in and say, okay, yeah, that might be your temptation, and it might be that's what you want to do, but we're not going to accept that. So just because something offers reproductive fitness doesn't mean it's a good thing. It's just saying in the logic of evolution, it's paid out in the past. All right, and then last note for this lecture, we want to think about evolutionary psychology as kind of a new kid on the block that is challenging some of the ways that social science has typically been done. And I'm going to kind of speak in very general terms, and I'm going to kind of perhaps overstate the case, but I want to give you a feel for this. So two big names in evolutionary psych, Tooby and Kosmitis, in 1992, in one of their major works, talked about the standard social science model, which they refer to as the SSSM. They suggest that this is the dominant social science paradigm, and it's one in which mind is seen as this all-purpose tool. They're saying that social science doesn't tend to look for how the mind is adapted to provide certain things in certain situations. That social science kind of think about the mind as maybe the ancient philosophers did, where the mind is akin to the very nature of the universe, and eventually the mind can understand the entire universe and be all-knowing and can transcend all its limits. Another feature of the dominant social science paradigm is that it tends to see differences in behavior as cultural, and it wants to believe that humans are infinitely malleable and that their orientation or their dispositions can be changed by the culture that they're raised in. So let me put some meat on those bones. If you're looking in psychology, so there's a long tradition in psychology going back to behaviorism and in much learning theory, where you want to understand the world in terms of people's or an organism's reinforcement contingencies. So if there's a certain stimulus that's paired with a certain reward, over time you make an association, boom, that's learning. Or you learn if you do a certain thing, you always get rewarded in a certain way. So that's operant conditioning. Well, what they found over time is that there's certain that works, it explains some things, but there's certain things it's really hard to get a rat to do. Because a rat is a certain kind of organism that has an ancestral history. So for a rat to push a lever, that's not very hard. But there's other things that you try to get a rat to do that they're just going to have a hard time doing because that's not the way they're wired. In cognitive psychology, there's still dominant is the information processing model. I have mode here, it should be model. But that's where the mind is understood as a computer. Well, there's a lot to that, and it's helpful for understanding things, but the human mind is really comprised of different kinds of things. It's not just purely computational. The human mind is embodied, and it takes into account different kinds of things of the environment. So, for example, there's research that if you're presented with a certain moral dilemma or a certain actor being described as doing a certain thing, if you are in an environment where there's less light, you're more inclined to see that person as immoral. Or in another case, if you're walking up to a stranger and you imagine yourself being with some of your homies, some of your friends, that stranger will not look as tall to you as it would as he or she would if you were alone. So in other words, your basic physical processing of what's going on with that stimuli is affected by other things in your brain, namely, what are my coalitional odds like relative to this person? Do I have friends with me, or should I be concerned? So we operate in ways that aren't consistent with that information processing model. Okay, and then to pick on social psychology in particular, because a lot of this course is going to deal with social stuff, social psychologists have talked about different kinds of predictors of liking. And then they talk about things like proximity, similarity, frequency. Well, it's very likely that those predictors of liking, what it's really tapping into are predictors of kinship. The extent to which those things are true, somebody's near us oftentimes, they're similar to us, and we have a high frequency of interaction, those might mean that we think of that person as kin. In other words, as sharing some of our genetic makeup. And that's why we like them. So there might be something deeper going on. Social psychology tends to see sex as socially constructed. And maybe not as much social psychology here, but a lot of the social sciences and the humanities tend to see sex as socially constructed, with few basic male-female psychological differences. And here, evolutionary psychology would often disagree. Many people explain aggression in boys as something that's learned from their culture, where the evidence suggests it occurs across all cultures. And so it may not be something that's cultural as much as something that's in the basic wiring of a boy's mind. We're inclined to see prejudice as something that's bad, and that it reflects a lack of learning or bad parenting, but it's some kind of deficit that the individual has. From an evolutionary perspective, we should expect that different kinds of prejudices are different kinds of strategies that try to bring us closer to our goals of reproductive fitness. So in other words, if we're prejudiced against people in a certain way, it's not to suggest that we're bad people or that we need to be educated. It could just be reflecting a disposition or an orientation that worked well in the ancestral environment. Now, I'm not arguing that we should be prejudiced, but to see a prejudice just as kind of a moral deficit or something that to be fixed maybe doesn't recognize the way it functioned and how it behaved in the evolutionary past. And then we'll talk about, you'll see oftentimes people talk about traditional sex roles. Well, it's often assumed and just taken for granted that that's the way those sex roles are because that's what tradition dictated. But there's not really a theory that's tied to reproductive fitness for what advantages those traditional sex roles had. So we'll talk about this later, but there's a chance that traditional sex roles work well when you have kinship groups that are fairly dense and you have a lot of kin around to help you raise children, and they work less well if you're in a modern, Western, more individualized environment where there are fewer kin to help you to provide resources. We can work through that logic later, but my point is there are certain things that really just don't show up as interesting in the standard social science model, and they're just kind of taken for granted, and evolution is asking us to kind of push past that basic bias. One quick side note, again, gesturing to the values kind of dimension, it might be that in many cases that standard social science model thinking comes from what we might consider a good place. So in other words, just to share my own personal values, I really want to respect individuals as individuals, and if they feel attracted to the same sex or they feel that they're in a body that doesn't represent their true sexual identity, then by all means I want to support that individual breaking through those taboos or liberating themselves from things that are keeping them from being happy. But I can hold that view and still think that there are likely some basic male-female differences that we'll see in most cases, or that show up at least in a large number of people. But what I'm suggesting is we want to believe oftentimes in the Western mind that individuals have a right to determine their own destiny. And so that may feed back into the way we view science and think about sex then as being purely socially constructed and something that's very malleable. But I think from an evolutionary perspective, we can reason that sex is not something that's likely to be left to chance from an evolutionary perspective, because so much rides on whether or not someone is able to have offspring that perpetuate perpetuate their genes. So we should expect that evolution has a lot to say about sex that's distinct from those features of it which are socially constructed. And if the sexual, if a lot of the LGBTQ kind of discourse that's happened in the last few years has been around the extent to which some of these norms are socially constructed, we can still embrace that and still at the same time accept that there might be some things that are beyond social construction and some other principles that we can identify and learn from. All right, and last but not least, on a hopefully humorous note, I want you to think about, does evolution ever make mistakes? So we got 4 creatures here that might seem kind of improbable, and I want you to identify which ones are real animals. So, it turns out the only one that's real is the platypus, but the platypus does look a little bit like it was designed by a committee, right? It's got the beak of a duck and then the body of a mammal. I'm like, what the heck's going on here? But unfortunately, the duck alligator, the jackalope, and the niffler from the Harry Potter movies are all fantastical creations that evolution, in fact, did not come up with. So, just remember that. Nifflers, cute, but not real.